The boardroom where my father's will was read was a perfect monument to the man himself, cold, imposing, and smelling faintly of money and antiseptic ambition. I sat at the far end of a long black marble table that felt like a tombstone, a ghost in a world that had never wanted me. My name is Caleb Vance, and I am an artist. In my family, that was a confession, not a profession. Across the table sat my older sister, Isabel, the true heir to the Vance dynasty. She was the perfect corporate predator, dressed in a suit so sharp it could cut glass, her expression a practiced mask of somber duty. She was the shark my father had always wanted, and I was the strange artistic fish that had somehow slipped through the net. We were not there to mourn a father. We were there to witness the formal, legal transfer of his empire. The air was thick with a tension that had been brewing for 30 years, the final silent act of a long and bitter family war that I had already, by all accounts, lost. The lawyer, a man who had served my father for decades, looked at me with an expression of faint, undisguised pity before he began. My mind drifted back to the last time I had seen my father alive. A decade ago in his study, a room that was a shrine to his own ruthless success. I had just told him I was dropping out of business school to enroll in the San Francisco Art Institute. The rage in his eyes had been a physical force, a storm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. "Art?" he had roared, his voice a weapon. "Art is a hobby for the wives of powerful men, Caleb. It is not a life. Vance builds empires. He does not dabble in pointless, sentimental nonsense." I had tried to explain that art was my passion, the only thing that made me feel alive, but he saw it not as a calling, but as a betrayal, a rejection of his entire world. "You are a disappointment," he had said, his voice dropping to a low, cold whisper that was far more terrifying than his rage. "You are no son of mine." I had walked out of his life that day, choosing the uncertain freedom of a starving artist over the gilded cage of his approval. I had chosen my soul over his empire, and he had never, ever forgiven me for it. The lawyer's voice, a dry, emotionless drone, pulled me back to the present. He read through a dizzying list of assets, a testament to my father's relentless ambition. "The controlling shares of the Vance Global Shipping Conglomerate," he read, "along with all its subsidiaries, properties and liquid assets I leave in their entirety to my daughter, Isabel Vance." I watched as a small, sharp, and utterly triumphant smile touched my sister's lips for a fraction of a second, before her mask of somber duty slipped back into place. She had done it. She had won the game. She had been the perfect, ruthless child, and now she had her reward. An empire built on a foundation of cold, hard steel and even colder, harder deals. I felt a strange sense of detachment, not of jealousy but of a quiet, weary resignation. I had made my peace with being disinherited years ago. I was only here out of a final, lingering sense of duty, a final goodbye to a man I had never truly known. Then the lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he read from a final, separate addendum. "And to my son Caleb," he read, and I could feel my sister's gaze, now sharp with a cruel, pitying curiosity, fall upon me. "To my son Caleb, from whom I have been long estranged, I leave my very first business property, the derelict structure known as Warehouse 13, located at the old southern port, along with all its contents." The lawyer paused, then read the final, cutting line. "I leave him this so that he may at long last finally understand the true value of a solid foundation." A single, sharp and utterly mirthless laugh escaped from my sister's lips. It was the perfect final insult. A rusty, worthless and likely condemned warehouse, a piece of urban blight in the worst part of the city, delivered with a final, posthumous lecture. My father, even from beyond the grave, had found a way to have the last word, to remind me that in his eyes I was, and always would be, a disappointment worthy only of his scraps. The meeting was adjourned. Isabel, now the head of a multi-billion-dollar empire, walked over to me, her expression a masterclass in feigned sympathy. "Caleb," she said, her voice a soft, condescending purr, "I am so sorry. I had no idea father could be so cruel." She placed a hand on my arm. "Listen," she continued, "and that warehouse, it's in a terrible state. It's a tax liability, really. Let me do you a favor. I'll buy it from you. $10,000 cash. It will save you the trouble of having to deal with it, and it will give you a little something to get by on." It was the final twist of the knife. She wasn't offering help. She was offering a pittance to take the final symbol of my humiliation off my hands, to complete her total and absolute victory. A hot, defiant anger, an emotion I had not felt in years, surged through me. I looked her straight in the eye. "Thank you for the offer, Isabel," I said, my voice cold and even. "But I think I'll keep it. After all, it's my inheritance." I turned and walked out of that room, leaving her with a look of baffled surprise on her face. I would keep the rusty, worthless warehouse. I would keep the final insult. I would own it. While I was wrestling with the strange, bitter inheritance of a single rusty key, my sister Isabel was taking her throne. Her first week as the CEO of Vance Global was, I later learned, a brutal awakening. The triumphant confidence she had worn so proudly at the will reading quickly evaporated, replaced by a frantic, gnawing panic. She discovered that the empire she had inherited was a house of cards, a hollowed-out shell on the verge of implosion. My father, in his final years, had apparently become a reckless gambler, leveraging the company to its absolute limit, taking on massive high-interest loans for a series of disastrously ambitious projects. The company was drowning in a sea of debt so vast it was almost incomprehensible. And circling the dying behemoth were the sharks my father had swum with his entire life, his business partners. A man named Marcus Corbin, a so-called family friend and a major shareholder, began to call in his debts, his friendly facade replaced by the cold, predatory gaze of a man who knew he was about to own a company for a fraction of its worth. Isabel, the brilliant corporate shark, had inherited a sinking ship, and the very men she had celebrated with were now the ones drilling holes in the hull. Meanwhile, my own world had shrunk to the size of my small, paint-splattered studio apartment. My father's final insult, the rusty warehouse, sat in the back of my mind, a problem I didn't have the energy to deal with. But my financial situation was becoming dire. A gallery that owed me money for a sold painting had just declared bankruptcy, and my landlord was making increasingly threatening noises about my overdue rent. I was at the end of my rope. My sister's insulting offer of $10,000 for the warehouse began to seem less like an insult and more like a lifeline. But my pride, a stubborn, foolish thing I had inherited directly from my father, wouldn't let me take it. I decided instead to see the place for myself, to assess what little value it might hold as scrap metal or reclaimed lumber. I found the old rusty key in the envelope from the lawyer, a key that felt like a symbol of my own diminished worth, and I drove down to the old southern port, a forgotten, derelict part of the city, where the skeletons of old ships rotted in the salt-flecked air. Warehouse 13 was a monster, a hulking, rust-streaked behemoth of corrugated steel that seemed to groan under the weight of its own decay. It was the last building at the end of a long-abandoned pier, surrounded by the ghosts of a once-thriving shipping industry. The air was thick with the smell of salt, rust, and neglect. It looked exactly as worthless as my sister had claimed, a final, fitting testament to my father's opinion of me. I stood before the massive sliding door, its surface a patchwork of faded paint and creeping rust. The lock was an ancient, heavy-duty mechanism, but the old key, to my surprise, slid into it with a smooth, practiced ease. It turned with a satisfying, deep-throated click, a sound that echoed in the quiet, desolate landscape. With a grunt of effort, I put my shoulder to the massive door and heaved. It groaned in protest, its rollers grinding on a century of rust and salt, and then it began to move, opening a sliver of absolute, impenetrable darkness within. A cool, still, and strangely clean air, an air that had been trapped for years, washed over me. I pulled out my phone, its flashlight beam cutting a sharp, nervous path through the darkness. And I froze. The inside of the warehouse was not what I expected. It was not a vast, empty, derelict space filled with cobwebs and rotting crates. It was an office, a perfectly preserved, meticulously organized, and fully functional shipping office, seemingly frozen in time since the 1980s. There were vintage computers on the desks, large clunky machines that were museum pieces. There were walls of filing cabinets, all neatly labeled. There was a massive, hand-drawn map of global shipping routes covering one entire wall. It was a time capsule, a command center from another era, all covered in a thin, uniform layer of dust, a silent testament to the day, years ago, when someone had simply turned off the lights and walked away. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This wasn't a derelict warehouse. It was a ghost office, a secret my father had kept hidden from the world. I spent the next hour exploring the strange, silent office in a state of bewildered awe. On the walls were detailed models of cargo ships, their glass cases coated in a fine layer of dust. In the filing cabinets I found not empty folders, but meticulously kept records, shipping manifests, and corporate documents for a company I had never heard of, Vance Maritime. I found deeds for a small but significant fleet of 6 cargo ships, all owned outright with no liens, no loans, no debt. I found financial statements showing a history of quiet, steady, and substantial profits. It was a completely separate, completely private, and completely solvent company, a secret, parallel empire that had been operating in the shadows of my father's public-facing behemoth, Vance Global. This was not a rusty, worthless warehouse. This was the secret, beating heart of my father's true legacy on the large, imposing mahogany desk in the center of the room. To a desk that had clearly been my father's, I found a single object that was free of dust, as if it had been placed there recently waiting for me. It was a thick, leather-bound journal. I sat down in his old high-backed leather chair, the same chair from a photograph I had from when I was a small boy, and I opened it. I was expecting to find the words of the tyrant I had known, the cold, ruthless businessman who had dismissed my life's passion. But the handwriting on the page, my father's familiar, strong script, was not that of a tyrant. It was that of a man in conflict, a man who was desperately trying to save his own soul. The first entry, dated 10 years ago, a week after our final, terrible argument, began with a sentence that shattered my entire perception of the man I had spent my life hating. "Caleb was right," he had written. "The world I have built is a world of sharks, and I am afraid, for the first time in my life, that I have forgotten how to be anything else." I sat in my father's forgotten chair, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light from a grimy window, and I began to read. The journals were not just a record of his life. They were a confession, a strategy guide, and a final, desperate letter to the only son he believed would ever understand. The man who emerged from those pages was not the cold, ruthless tycoon I had spent my life hating. He was a man trapped, a lion in a cage of his own making. The story he told was one of a slow, creeping betrayal, not by him, but against him. His business partners, led by the man I had known my whole life as the charming and avuncular Uncle Marcus Corbin, were not his partners at all. They were parasites. He wrote with a chilling, detached clarity of how he had discovered their scheme years ago. They had been systematically embezzling from Vance Global, using a complex web of offshore accounts and fraudulent invoices to bleed the company dry, all while positioning themselves to seize control when it finally collapsed. He was surrounded by sharks, and he knew that a direct confrontation would mean his own financial and personal ruin. They were too powerful, their connections too deep. So he had devised a plan, a long, patient, and utterly ruthless plan of his own. Vance Global, the shining beacon of his public success, was to become a trap, a honeypot. His journals laid out the strategy in meticulous, brilliant detail. He had spent the last decade of his life not trying to save Vance Global, but secretly accelerating its demise in a controlled demolition. He had intentionally taken on massive toxic debts. He had invested in deliberately flawed projects, all to make the public company seem like a bloated, dying whale. He was making it an irresistible target for his greedy partners, luring them in, encouraging them to invest their own stolen money back into the company they thought they were about to conquer. The public company, the empire my sister had just inherited, was nothing but a hollowed-out shell, a massive, spectacular illusion designed to attract all the sharks into one single, inescapable net. He was a master of a game they didn't even know they were playing. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a grandmaster of corporate warfare, and this was to be his final posthumous masterpiece of destruction. Every move that had seemed like a failure, every bad investment that had tarnished his reputation in his final years, had been a deliberate, calculated move in a game of unimaginable stakes. And then I found the entries about me. And the truth, when it came, was a blow to the heart so profound it left me breathless. He wrote of our final terrible argument, the day I had walked out of his life. But he wrote of it not with anger, but with a deep, heartbreaking regret. "Caleb's integrity," he wrote, His refusal to play the game is his greatest strength. It is the one thing in this family that is not corrupted, and I will not allow them to corrupt him. His decision to disown me, the act that had defined my entire adult life, had not been an act of rejection. It had been an act of desperate, savage protection. He had to sever all legal and financial ties with me, to make our estrangement public and absolute, to ensure that when the toxic edifice of Vance Global finally imploded, I would be safely outside the blast radius. He was not pushing me away. He was pushing me into a lifeboat, just before he steered his own ship directly into the iceberg. The final cruel insult of the will, the gift of the rusty, worthless warehouse, was, in fact, the greatest act of love he had ever shown me. It was the only real, clean and unencumbered asset he had left to give. The journals then revealed the other half of his brilliant secret strategy. While he was deliberately sinking Vance Global, he was simultaneously and secretly building an ark. The private, unassuming company I had just discovered, Vance Maritime, was that ark. For years he had been legally and meticulously siphoning the real, tangible assets, the ships, the contracts, the clean profits, out of the public company and into the private one. He had used a labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore holdings to make the transfers untraceable. Vance Maritime was completely debt-free, incredibly profitable, and most importantly, completely invisible to his partners and to the financial world. It was the real legacy, the solid, honest shipping company he had started with, now preserved and protected, a ghost fleet waiting for its new captain. The warehouse, the final insult, was not just a building. It was the key to an entire hidden empire, an empire he had built in the shadows specifically for me. He had left my sister a crown of thorns, a poisoned chalice of a company designed to fail. And he had left me the foundation, the true foundation he had mentioned in his will, the one thing of real, lasting value. The final piece of his posthumous plan was contained in a heavy, industrial safe hidden behind a false wall in the back of the warehouse office. The combination, of course, was in the journal, the date of my mother's birthday. Inside it was not gold or cash. It was something far more valuable, evidence. For over a decade, my father had been a silent, meticulous detective, gathering proof of his partner's crimes. There were audio tapes of secret meetings, copies of falsified ledgers, detailed records of the offshore accounts where they had hidden the embezzled money. It was an airtight prosecutable case against Marcus Corbin and his entire cabal. My father hadn't just planned to bankrupt them, he had planned to destroy them, to ensure they would pay for their betrayal not just with their money, but with their freedom. He had armed me with a weapon of absolute destruction, a final, righteous tool to clean the house he had built. As I sat there in the dusty, silent office, the journals open, the tapes in my hand, the full, staggering weight of my father's love and his genius settled upon me. He had been a ruthless man, yes, but his ruthlessness had been a shield, a complex and painful strategy to protect the only two things in the world he had truly loved, the honest company he had first built, and the son he had been forced to push away. My anger and resentment towards him, the defining emotions of my entire adult life, evaporated, replaced by a profound, aching sense of a love I had never understood. I was not the forgotten son. I was the chosen one, the one he had trusted with his true legacy. With a newfound, almost terrifying sense of purpose, I went to one of the old dusty computers in the office. I managed to get it online through an old dial-up connection, and I searched the news. The headline was on every financial news site. The massive, spectacular bankruptcy auction of Vance Global was scheduled for the end of the week. The trap was about to spring, and my father's ghost was waiting for me to be his final, avenging hand. The bankruptcy auction for Vance Global was held in a massive, impersonal hotel ballroom, a place devoid of history or soul, which felt fitting for the occasion. The room was a feeding frenzy, a gathering of corporate vultures and bottom feeders from across the financial world, all eager to pick over the bones of my father's fallen empire. At the front of the room, looking like a triumphant predator, sat Marcus Corbin, surrounded by his cabal of treacherous partners. They were the architects of this destruction, and now they were here to claim their prize. And in the corner, looking small, defeated, and utterly humiliated, sat my sister Isabel. Her corporate armor was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been brutally and publicly outmaneuvered. She thought she had lost her inheritance to a sea of debt. She had no idea the truth was far more complex, and that she had been a pawn in a much larger, more brilliant game. The auctioneer began, his voice a fast, emotionless drone, listing the assets of the company. Fleets of ships burdened with liens, properties mortgaged to the hilt, a brand name now synonymous with failure. It was a funeral, and Corbin and his cronies were the gleeful undertakers. I arrived just as the main bidding was about to begin. I was not alone. I was flanked by a team of sharp, serious-looking lawyers from a top litigation firm, men who moved with a quiet, confident authority that made heads turn. I was no longer the estranged artist in a worn-out jacket. I wore a custom-tailored dark suit, a piece of armor my father had ironically made for me years ago for a gala I had refused to attend. It fit perfectly. My arrival caused a stir, a ripple of confusion through the room. Corbin and his partners looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and contempt, dismissing my presence as a final, pathetic act of a sentimental fool. My sister, Isabel, looked at me with a bewildered, almost desperate hope, as if she were seeing a ghost. I ignored them all, my gaze fixed on the stage, my expression calm, focused, and unreadable. I was not here to plead or to mourn. I was here to execute my father's final, brilliant, and ruthless move. The auction for the entire conglomerate began. As expected, the room was mostly silent. The company was too toxic, too laden with debt for any sane investor to touch. The auctioneer, a man clearly in Corbin's pocket, called for an opening bid. Corbin's lawyer stood up, his voice booming with a false sense of magnanimity. "On behalf of the primary creditors consortium," he announced, "we open the bidding at $50 million. It was a laughably low number for an empire that was once worth billions, but it was just enough to cover the secured debts and give them control of everything. The auctioneer, with practiced speed, began his count. "I have a bid for $50 million. Do I hear 60? Going once. Going twice." The gavel was raised, poised to fall and officially transfer the remnants of my father's legacy into the hands of the very men who had destroyed him. Corbin's face was alight with a broad, predatory smile. He had won. Just as the auctioneer's gavel began its final descent, my lawyer stood up, his voice cutting through the silent room with a calm, clear authority. "We would like to enter a motion to suspend this auction, pending the presentation of evidence of criminal fraud and embezzlement directly related to the assets in question." The room erupted into a pandemonium of shouts and confused murmurs. Corbin's lawyers were on their feet, screaming objections, but the federal bankruptcy official overseeing the auction, his face grim and intrigued, banged his own gavel for silence. "The motion is highly unusual," he said, "but the accusation is serious. I will allow it." I then stepped forward, my path cleared by my legal team. I did not address the bidders or the auctioneer. I addressed the bankruptcy official and the assembled press. "The sale of Vance Global cannot proceed," I stated, my voice ringing with a power I didn't know I possessed, "because the company did not fail. It was deliberately and systematically looted from the inside by its own partners, led by that man, Marcus Corbin." My lawyer then began the presentation. It was a systematic, brutal, and undeniable demolition. He projected onto the large screens in the ballroom the evidence my father had so meticulously collected. He showed the falsified ledgers, the doctored shipping manifests, the complex web of offshore accounts that showed hundreds of millions of dollars being siphoned out of Vance Global and into Corbin's private holdings over a period of 10 years. He then played the audio tapes. The entire room, including the stunned reporters, listened in horrified silence to the clear, undeniable sound of Corbin and his partners plotting their betrayal, their voices a casual, chilling testament to their own corruption. As the final, most damning tape played, a recording of Corbin bragging about how he would drive Richard Vance to an early grave, two quiet men in dark suits, who had been standing at the back of the room, began to walk calmly and deliberately towards Corbin's table. They were federal agents. The auction was no longer an auction. It was a crime scene. Corbin and his partners were arrested on the spot, a stunning public takedown captured by every news camera in the room. As they were being led away in handcuffs, their faces masks of pure, disbelieving horror, I took the microphone one last time. "My father knew this day would come," I announced to the silent, shell-shocked room, "and he prepared for it." I then revealed the existence of the real company, the secret, debt-free and immensely profitable Vance Maritime, his true legacy, which I now controlled. The loyal employees of Vance Global, I declared, looking at the stunned faces of the workers who had come to witness the death of their careers, will not be abandoned. Vance Maritime will be absorbing all of your contracts, and your pensions will be protected. A wave of shocked, tearful and thunderous applause erupted from the employees. They had come expecting a funeral and had just been given a resurrection. The epilogue of my father's brilliant, tragic story was written in the headlines that followed. Corbin and his partners faced a massive federal indictment, their corporate empire crumbling into dust. The hollowed-out shell of Vance Global ceased to exist, its fraudulent debts dying with it. And I, the estranged artist, the forgotten son, was now the reluctant but respected head of Vance Maritime, a powerful and scrupulously honest shipping company. I had not just inherited a fortune, I had inherited a profound and heavy responsibility. A responsibility to honor the good man my father had been forced to hide from the world. I had saved thousands of jobs. I had restored my family's name, and I had, in the most public way imaginable, fulfilled my father's final, desperate wish for justice. My first act as the new head of the Vance legacy was not to buy a yacht or a penthouse. It was to go to my sister. I found her in the now empty boardroom of the company she had briefly and disastrously inherited. She was a broken woman, her arrogance shattered, replaced by a deep and profound shame. I didn't say a word. I simply placed my father's journals on the table in front of her. For the next few hours we sat in silence as she read, the truth of his love, his sacrifice, and his brilliant, terrible plan washing over her. She finally understood. His coldness towards her, his constant pressure, it had all been part of his performance, a way to keep her in the game, to make her a believable pawn in his war against Corbin. And his rejection of me had been his only way to save me. She wept, not for the lost money, but for the father she had never truly known. In that room, amidst the wreckage of their father's lies, a brother and sister, torn apart by a lifetime of misunderstanding, finally began to find their way back to each other, ready to build a new legacy together.